E3 2016 is now over, as we all know, but one of the things that we had revealed at the Sony conference, which was one of the last conferences of the event, was of course Resident Evil 7. Now, as we all saw from the trailer, it's looking like a very nice departure from the action-heavy games of Resident Evil 5 and 6. Which is not really what Resident Evil is supposed to be about. You know, the main characters in those games were pretty much unstoppable killing machines. There was no sort of ammo management or any survival elements at all in those games. It was very much, hey, we're an action game now. Which is not really what I wanted from Resident Evil. The best Resident Evil in my mind is Resident Evil 4, followed by Resident Evil 2, so I've wanted, along with many others, a return to survival horror. And judging from what we saw, it seems that the case, and we now have some comments from the director of Resident Evil 7, Kushi Nakanishi, and it seems that's very much the case. If you're looking for an action-packed game like 5 or 6, then Resident Evil 7 isn't the one for you, it seems. Now, what we'd also learned before I go into the quote from Mr. Nakanishi is that it will be a far smaller scale game with a claustrophobic experience and a heavy focus on setting an atmosphere, and also entirely taking place in one location, which is somewhere out in the wilderness of Louisiana. So we're not going to be getting another globe-trotting adventure like we had with 5 or 6. It's all going to be this one location, which doesn't mean it's going to be small exactly, it's just going to be smaller than we had, and very much for, hey, you're surrounded by either like decrepit buildings or in a decrepit building, or maybe like somewhere out in the trees. You know, definitely having that feeling of claustrophobia that is definitely an element of the older Resident Evils. So let's move swiftly on to the quotes from Nakanishi, shall we? And he said, quote, "The game is survival horror. If anyone out there has a bloodlust for holding a gun, check out Umbrella Corps. We are separating these aspects out into different titles where that gameplay can come to the fore and makes that most sense for that title. Resident Evil 7 is not going to be a gunfest." Now, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the main characters of Resident Evil 5 and 6, and to some degree 4, pretty much felt like unstoppable killing machines, and obviously were sort of highly trained special ops, you know, army guys. And now we have a focus on a new normal protagonist, which is going to be a nice change after, say, Chris from Stars or whatever. Now, Nakanishi continued, quote, "It's a normal person protagonist. We're getting back to basics. In Resident Evil 1, Chris was not a comic book hero. He was a Special Forces agent, but he wasn't as advanced a fighter as later in the series." Now, have no fear, we're not going to be having an Outlast or an Amnesia here. Combat will still be in the game, and people who've actually been examining the trial in detail have discovered clues to an axe weapon. Now, so basically this means that we're going back to older style Resident Evils where, hey, yeah, there was combat, but you need to watch your ammo, you need to think carefully about what enemies are actually worth the ammo and the time and the risk to yourself to take out. And of course, if you didn't kill them, then obviously you're risking getting bit and that sort of thing. And that's very much an element that's been missing from the more recent Resident Evil, shall we say. And it seems with the axe weapon, if indeed that is true and it's going to be in the final product, then we're going to be getting actual proper melee combat other than just, hey, there's a knife, which is what we had previously. However, we will be seeing the return of herbs. That was confirmed by the producer Masachika Kawata, which is pretty nice, a classic Resident Evil element that thankfully isn't going anywhere. Now, obviously, given the massive change in direction for Resident Evil 7, a lot of people have been wondering, is this some kind of reboot, kind of, even though it's called Resident Evil 7? And obviously, well, it isn't. It is a continuation of the franchise, and it is set after the events of 5 and 6, and still takes place in that same world. So we're probably going to be seeing a few recurring monsters and that sort of thing. And I've got some further comments here from Nakanishi, and he said, quote, "It's not a reboot, it's a rebuilding from the ground up. It's still set in the Resident Evil universe, and while the action in the demo takes place around this plantation house, it is happening in the same world as the other Resident Evil characters inhabit. The title is Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, which as well as being the title of the series in Japan, is also a clue as to what's going on in this game." Now, I have seen many comments from many Resident Evil fans that this doesn't seem like Resident Evil. It seems like a massive departure for the series, but the thing is, like, yeah, the change of perspective is surprising. I was very surprised to see that the first-person gameplay is actually seemingly how we're going to be getting it, at least judging from the demo. You know, so we haven't seen the full game, but it's a safe assumption that's going to be the perspective. But other than that, we had puzzle elements, we had key hunting, we had obviously weird monsters and the sort of old claustrophobic elements, and from what we've heard, there will be sort of ammo management and having to run away from enemies and perhaps use of melee as well. This is all sounding like Resident Evil to me, and may I remind everyone as well that Resident Evil 4 at the time of release was at the time a huge departure for Resident Evil. You know, we went from the sort of top-down tank controls of the old games to over-the-shoulder, more sort of panicky scares rather than, say, survival horror. You know, Resident Evil 4 is one of the best Resident Evil games ever made, in my opinion. As I said, 4 than 2 for me. And it was a huge departure, so Resident Evil 7 might be that. This is looking really promising. I have way more hope for the main line of Resident Evil now than I did a couple of years ago. To be honest, I'd written off Resident Evil as just being like, hey, we're an action game now, lol, even though we don't, you know, we have 5 million action games and barely any horror these days. But no, it seems we are finally getting the horror game we'd all asked for, and despite the change of perspective, looking at the demo, I haven't played it yet, but looking at all the gameplay and all everything else, all the theories, it's looking like Resident Evil at its core, just with a few changes and a bit of a sprinkle of Silent Hill in there, and I'm okay with that. I am more than okay with that. As I said, Resident Evil 4 was a huge departure, and that is the best Resident Evil, or one of the best Resident Evils, so I guess this is wait and see for the full game, and judge then, I suppose. It's looking interesting, which is more than I would have said previously. So, let me know your thoughts and opinions as always, guys. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.